As we approach the dawn of the 21st century, after the death of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, this man, Jesus Christ, continues to fascinate the minds of thinking men and women around the world. The recent Peter Jennings special, In the Search of Jesus, attracted some 16 million viewers across the country. But who is Jesus really? Is he, as the Bible says, the divine Son of God? Or was he merely a human prophet, as Muslims have been taught to believe? Who is this real Jesus? And we're going to talk about that tonight. Now, I propose to answer that question as a historian. I shall look at the New Testament and at the Quran, and as the historians look at any other source for ancient history. I shall not treat them as inspired or holy books tonight, now, though I know myself and also my friend Shabir believe that they are inspired. Accordingly, I shall not require them to be inerrant or infallible in order to be valuable historical sources, at least not for tonight. By taking this historical approach, we prevent the debate from degenerating into arguments over Bible difficulties or Quranic inconsistencies. The question is not whether the sources are inerrant, but whether they allow us to discover an accurate portrait of the historical Jesus. Now, in order to determine who the historical Jesus really was, we need to have some objective criteria for assessing our sources. And what I'd like to use is Professor John Mayer, an eminent New Testament historian, who lists the following 4 criteria. First of all, multiple independent sources and early sources. Events which are reported by independent and especially early sources are likely to be historical. Dissimilarity is another one. If a saying or event is different from prior Judaism and also from later Christianity, then it probably doesn't derive from either one of the, and so belongs to the historical Jesus. And examples of these would be the Son of Man issue, which I'll talk about later, the fact that Jesus called his God Father, Abba, or even that he was buried in a tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. These would be things that you would not find earlier with the Jewish writings, or certainly would not find later with the Christian writings. The third criteria will be embarrassment. Sayings or events that would have been embarrassing or difficult for the Christian church are unlikely to have been invented, and so are likely historical. Let me give you some examples of these. The baptism of Jesus would be an example of this, where it would have been difficult for the early church to have understood why Jesus, who he was sinless, needed to be baptized, because of the significance of what baptism meant. Some of the sayings of Jesus, for instance, his apocalyptic sayings, this would have been an embarrassment, because if this was the Son of God, why did he not know the end of times, or the date of the second coming, for instance? Or the women's testimony there at the tombs. The fact that women were the ones that were the first ones to recognize or to come across the empty tombs. This would have been an embarrassment, and therefore would be a good criteria for understanding that they are likely historical. And then fourthly, rejection and execution. Jesus' crucifixion is so indisputably established as an anchor point in history that words and deeds of Jesus must be assessed in terms of their likelihood of leading to his execution as King of the Jews. A bland Jesus who just preached monotheism would never have provoked such an opposition. When we apply such criteria to the New Testament, we're able to establish a good deal about the historical Jesus. Let me discuss just 3 of the facts that emerge about this remarkable man, using those 4 criteria. First and foremost, Jesus' radical self-concept. The Quran says that Jesus thought of himself as no more than a human prophet who told people to worship the one true God. However, on the basis of this criteria, it can be shown that among the historically authentic words of Jesus are claims which reveal his divine self-understanding. Take, for example, Jesus' claim to be the Son of Man. The criteria for multiple sources and dissimilarity show it belongs to a historical Jesus. Now, most laymen probably think that this title refers to Jesus' humanity, just as the title Son of God refers to his deity, but that's a mistake. It fails to take into account the Jewish background of the expression, what the authors had intended to say. We must do that whenever we look into one of the sayings, or certainly that which we find in any scripture. In the Old Testament book of Daniel, chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, Daniel sees a vision of a divine human figure coming on the clouds of heaven, to whom God will give everlasting authority, glory, and dominion. No mere human being could be accorded such status, for this would be to commit the sin which Muslims call shirk, giving something which properly belongs to God alone to someone else. Yet this is the status which Jesus claimed for himself. Probably the most famous Son of Man saying by Jesus comes at his trial before the Jewish high priest, and I quote, "Then the high priest stood up and asked Jesus, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." The high priest tore his clothes. "You have heard blasphemy. What do you think?" They all condemned him as worthy of death. I get that from Mark 14, verses 60 to 64. Now, every Muslim sitting here would have to agree with the high priest and the council that Jesus is a blasphemer who is worthy of death because he had made himself equal with God by making those claims. Not only did Jesus claim to be the Son of Man, but he also thought of himself as the unique Son of God. Jesus' self-understanding as God's special Son comes to expression in his parable of the wicked tenants of the vineyard, which even the radical skeptical critics in the so-called Jesus seminar recognize as authentic. In this parable, the vineyard symbolizes Israel. The owner of the vineyard is God. The tenants are the Jewish religious leaders, and the servants are the prophets sent by God. In Mark 12, 1-9, we read, "A man planted a vineyard and rented it to some farmers. At harvest time, he sent a servant to the tenants to collect from them some of the fruit of the vineyard. But they seized him, beat him, and sent him away empty-handed. Then he sent another servant to them. They struck this man on the head and treated him shamefully. He sent still another, and that one they killed. He sent many others. Some of them they beat, others they killed. He had one left to send, a son whom he loved. He sent him last of all, saying, 'They will respect my son.' But the tenants said to one another, 'This is the heir, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours.' So they took him and they killed him." Mark 12, 1-9. Now, what does this parable tell us about Jesus' self-understanding? Well, it tells us four things. That Jesus thought of himself, first of all, as his beloved Son. Secondly, that he thought of himself as distinct from all the other prophets. Thirdly, that he was God's final messenger. And fourthly, that he was heir to Israel. He did not think of himself as merely another human prophet, as Muslims like to believe. Jesus' self-concept as God's special Son comes to explicit expression in Matthew 11:27. "All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." It is unlikely the church invented this saying because it says that the Son is unknowable. No one knows the Son except the Father. But for the post-Easter church, we can know the Son. So by the criterion of dissimilarity, this saying is authentic. What does this saying then tell us about Jesus' self-concept? It tells us that he thought of himself as the exclusive Son of God and the only revelation of God to mankind. Now, this is really incredible. Think of what he is saying here. Understand of the importance of what he is doing. Yet this is what the historical Jesus believed. C.S. Lewis was right when he said, "A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would either be a lunatic on the level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. You can either shut him up as a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left us that open to us." Now, what's the second thing that Jesus said about who he was? This is Jesus' trial and crucifixion. I would like to go right into it. According to the Gospels, Jesus was condemned by the Jewish high court on the charge of blasphemy and then delivered to the Romans for execution for the treason of claiming to be king of the Jews. Not only are these facts confirmed by independent biblical sources like Paul and the Acts of the Apostles, but they are also confirmed by extra-biblical sources. From the Jewish historian Josephus and the Syrian writer Mara ben Bar-Serapion, we learned that the Jewish leaders made a formal accusation against Jesus and participated in events leading up to his crucifixion. From the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 43a, we learned that Jewish involvement in the trial was explained as a proper undertaking against the heretic. And from Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus, we learned that Jesus was crucified by Roman authority under the sentence of Pontius Pilate. According to L.T. Johnson, a New Testament historian at Emory University, I think that's right here in Atlanta, the support for the mode of his death, its agent, and perhaps its co-agents is overwhelming. Jesus faced a trial before his death, was condemned, and executed by crucifixion. Perhaps the single most egregious historical error found in the Quran is its claim that Jesus was not in fact crucified. Not only is there not a single shred of evidence in favor of this remarkable hypothesis, but the evidence supporting Jesus' crucifixion is, as Johnson says, overwhelming. Those of you who are here tonight who are Muslims need to appreciate that no one who is not already a Muslim believes that the historical Jesus was not crucified. The crucifixion of Jesus is recognized even by the skeptical critics in the Jesus Seminar as, to quote Robert Funk, one indisputable fact. Indeed, Paula Fredrickson, whose book From Jesus to Christ inspired the PBS special by the same name, declares roundly, the crucifixion is the strongest single fact we have about Jesus. Thirdly, Jesus' resurrection. What happened to Jesus after his crucifixion? The majority of scholars who have written on this subject agree that three things happened. First of all, on the Sunday morning following the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of women followers. Secondly, on multiple occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. And thirdly, the disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead despite their every predisposition to the contrary. I think the best explanation of these three facts is that the disciples were right. God had raised Jesus from the dead. This has enormous theological significance. For as the German theologian Wolfhart Pannenberg explains, the resurrection of Jesus acquires such decisive meaning not merely because someone or anyone has been raised from the dead, but because it is Jesus of Nazareth whose execution was instigated, because he had blasphemed against God. If this man was raised from the dead, then that plainly means that the God whom he had supposedly blasphemed has committed himself to him. In summary, on purely historical grounds, we have seen, one, that Jesus of Nazareth possessed a radical self-concept, the unique Son of God and also the Son of Man. Secondly, that he was tried, that he was condemned, and that he was crucified for his allegedly blasphemous claims. And thirdly, that God raised him from the dead in vindication of those claims. All this is in contradiction to the Quran's erroneous claims that Jesus thought of himself as a mere prophet, preaching a blasé monotheism, that he was not crucified, and that he did not raise from the dead. When you think about it, however, it's hardly surprising that the Quran gets the facts wrong about Jesus. You see, most scholars agree that the New Testament was written down within the first generation after the events it records, while the eyewitnesses to Jesus' life were still alive. This is significant, because they would have been still around to corroborate the events or sayings contained in the New Testament accounts. The Quran was written or compiled over 600 to 700 years later, not in Palestine, but in Arabia, with no independent historical source of information. That's why no historians today turn to the Quran as a historical source for studying the life of Jesus, or I should say few historians turn to the Quran today as a historical source for studying the life of Jesus. In fact, the Quran contains demonstrably legendary stories about Jesus which grew up during the centuries after his death. What am I referring to? Well, I'm referring to stories about Jesus which are found in the so-called apocryphal Gospels. These are forgeries which appeared in the 2nd and 3rd centuries after Christ, and which the Quran unwittingly repeats as facts, taking those stories and including them into the texts we find in the Quran today. For example, the Quran mentions the story borrowed from the forged document entitled The Infancy of Gospel of Thomas, of how the boy Jesus made a bird out of clay and then made it come to life. Such stories are legendary fictions. Thus, the Quran, in contrast to the New Testament, is, if I may speak frankly, worthless as an independent historical source for Jesus. Historically speaking, then, the answer to our question is clear. The real Jesus is the person described in the New Testament, not the legendary fabrication contained in the Quran. The paper that I have just read was not written by me. It's not my material. It's actually Dr. William Craig's material. And I'm very happy to present it today. I wish he could be here to do it, because he's a much better man than I in this subject.
Mr. Ali, 10-minute rebuttal.
Thank you.
I begin with praise for the only true God who was worshipped by Abraham, Moses, and Jesus. I ask him to send peace and blessings on all his prophets and messengers. In this part of our debate, my task is to answer this question. Who is the true Jesus? Is he the Jesus of the Bible? I've also to support my answer with reason, with evidence, and proof. First, a clarification of terms. According to the NIV Bible Dictionary, the word Christ means the same as the word Messiah. Hence, we can exchange one for the other. I will now examine the image of Jesus as crucified Messiah. This is the image most present, most prominent in the writings of Paul, the most influential writer in the New Testament. Paul says, we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23 in the NIV. Now here is the problem. A crucified Christ is a contradiction in terms. By definition, the Messiah has to be victorious over his enemies. What happens if he is killed by the enemy? In his paper, The Evidence for the Resurrection, Jay writes, and I quote him, "The rule was that if your Messiah was killed, then obviously he was not the true Messiah." End of quote. So then, if Jesus was killed, then obviously he was not the true Messiah. If he was the true Messiah, he couldn't be crucified. If he was crucified, he couldn't be the true Messiah. Jay may say, no problem, Shabir. Jesus rose from the dead, so he is the true Messiah after all. And I would say, okay, Jay, bring your proof. If Jay proves that Jesus rose from the dead, then I must reverse my judgment. But until Jay proves it, I should keep believing that a crucified Messiah is as self-refuting as a square circle, a four-sided triangle, or a married bachelor. Now, this is the proof that Jay should have concentrated on. Instead, he spent his time telling us that, Jesus claimed this or that, or how can we discover the true words of Jesus, and that Jesus was definitely crucified according to the judgment of Roman historians and all of that. He states this as the one indisputable fact. But the one indisputable fact we need to find out is that he resurrected from the dead, and this is what Jay has to provide evidence for. Instead, he resorts to referring to the Quran as legendary fabrication, which I take offense with. But notice this. Paul wrote, "If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is useless, and your believing it is useless." 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 14. So everything hangs on this one simple question: was Jesus raised from the dead? Now let me look at the evidence for the resurrection to see if there is any hope that Jay could actually persuade us tonight, or that anyone can persuade us that Jesus actually rose from the dead. I will show that the gospel evidence is marred by contradiction and doubt. Let me begin with the first of the four gospels. Dr. William Lane Craig writes, Mark is the earliest of our gospels. So let's look at that gospel. What is the total evidence in this gospel that Jesus reappeared to his disciples? Jesus' body is missing from his tomb. A young man in white clothes said that Jesus is raised and will be seen in Galilee. Mark does not say that this man is an angel and does not describe the actual reappearance of Jesus. You see the actual lack of evidence. Even here, where it says that Jesus is going to reappear in Galilee, is in a verse which, according to Wolfhart Pannenberg, is not in the pre-Markan gospel narrative, or the pre-Markan passion narrative. And notice that Jay referred to Wolfhart Pannenberg as an authority on these matters. So according to that, then we have no evidence in the Gospel of Mark that Jesus ever resurrected or appeared to anyone. Let me continue. This is why many hands came adding verses to Mark to boost the evidence. Some added a short ending, some added a long ending. You'll find some of these in your Bibles. Some added a short and a long ending, and some added a piece into the long ending to make it longer. Bruce Metzger, the recognized textual expert, shows that anything after verse 8 is a later addition. This is in his book, The Text of the New Testament, Its Transmission, Corruption, and Restoration, page 226. Now, not being satisfied with Mark, others wrote new and improved Gospels. Matthew improves the story by supplying guards at the tomb to assure us that no one could have stolen the body. But, as Raymond Brown points out, if there were guards at the tomb, as described in Matthew, the other Gospels would make little sense. The NIV Bible commentary says, "We do not hesitate to speak of Matthew's changes of, additions to, and omissions from Mark. Each writer comes up with his own improved version, and the versions contradict each other. According to Matthew, Jesus appeared to his disciples in Galilee, but according to Luke, the disciples were in Jerusalem all this time, some 90 miles away from the scene of the sighting. The best of today's New Testament scholars admit this problem. In our last debate, Jay insisted that I should take my information from Raymond Brown. Brown writes, "It is quite obvious that the Gospels do not agree as to where and to whom Jesus appeared after his resurrection." That's in the Anchor Bible Commentary, volume 29a, page 969. Jay may say these variations prove that the writers did not all agree to tell the same lie, but it also shows that they didn't get their facts right. John chapter 20 shows that the disciples often sat around discussing these events. In the end, they should all have the same information. If they wrote the Gospels, or even supplied the information for the Gospels would not contradict each other on such fundamental issues. In principle, Jay admits that the Bible has problems. After trying hard to resolve 101 cleared-up contradictions, or 101 contradictions in the Bible, Jay and others write on their final page that the remaining problems can be counted on your fingers and toes. To me, that means that there are more than 10 problems. I conclude, we cannot believe these contradictory reports about who saw Jesus and where. Another problem. The Gospels try to prove that Jesus reappeared, yet they often show that Jesus could not be positively identified. Matthew's Gospel says that the disciples saw Jesus and worshipped him, but some doubted. Matthew 28:17. The Living Bible says, but some of them weren't sure it really was Jesus. The New American Bible reads, but they doubted, which means they all doubted. The doubt is not always mentioned, to be sure, but in 101 Cleared-Up Contradictions in the Bible, page 48, Jay and others write that this passage is a summary of all the appearances of Christ. This allows me to conclude that in summary, the disciples were not sure they really saw Jesus. Acts of the Apostles in the Bible shows the disciples speaking as though they had seen Jesus, but according to the editors of the New American Bible, the author of Acts has put these words into the mouths of the apostles, of the disciples, rather. According to a popular myth, the cross killed the faith of the disciples, but the resurrection revived their faith. But here are the facts. The disciples did not need the resurrection to fuel their faith. After the crucifixion, they continued to believe in Jesus as a great prophet. On the other hand, Paul's faith was fueled by a vision in which Jesus authorized him as an apostle. But this vision is questionable for many reasons. Here are them. First, Paul did not know Jesus enough to make a positive identification. Second, Paul opposed Peter to his face. And who was Peter? Authorized by Paul, according to Matthew 16. Third, Barnabas sided with Peter and split from Paul. Fourth, Paul's followers in Galatia and Corinth seriously questioned his authority. And fifth, Paul's authority is recognized in the second letter of Peter, but according to Bruce Metzger, this letter was not written by Peter, but by someone else using Peter's name. Nevertheless, Paul went on to become the most influential writer of the New Testament. Paul's crucified Messiah is the dominant image of Jesus in the Bible. It is this image that I reject. It is as self-refuting as a square circle, a four-sided triangle, or a married bachelor. Recall what Jay wrote. The rule was that if your Messiah was killed, then obviously he was not the true Messiah. If he was the Messiah, he couldn't be crucified. If he was crucified, he couldn't be the Messiah. Jay can advance many arguments, and my reply will follow, but since we have proved now that the evidence for Jesus' reappearance is seriously flawed, every other argument fails. Hence, Old Testament prophecies fail. New Testament prophecies fail. The empty tomb proves nothing. If Jay cannot argue for the resurrection, speaking about these other topics that he's spoken about is really pointless. I leave you with these words of Paul. If Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is useless, and your believing it is useless. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 14. All we have so far, and all that we can see, is that if we look at the Bible, we have evidence, or lack of evidence rather, and the evidence that is there shows that there were some conflicting reports of unconfirmed and unidentified sightings. I leave it to Jay to give us some real evidence.
Shabir, first and foremost, I think you need to be careful when you say that the resurrection is not confirmed. It has been confirmed. We went through some of those, and you try to find contradictions with them. Now, let me give you a little background as to why Shabir is referring to this 101 contradictions. This is a paper that we've given back and forth to each other. Shabir came up with 101 contradictions in our Bible, and quite a few of them focused on the resurrection. It's one of his favorite topics. So a group of us got together, and we decided to answer every one of these 101 contradictions. We slapped up cleared up contradictions, and we slapped it back to him. And this is what he's referring to. All of those contradictions can be cleared up. The problems that you're finding is not with the contradictions. The problems you're quoting about on on your hands and fingers were your problems. That's what we stated very clearly at the end of the paper. You basically made 15 errors over and over again in the 101 contradictions. For those of you who want to read this, you can go up on our website and pull it down. I'm not going to waste my time today to try to understand and try to put together every one of the contradictions, because there's a plethora of supposed contradictions in the Bible that have been around for over 100 years. Many of the ones that Subtitle likes to focus in on are nothing new, and they've all been answered very well, not only by us, but by others much more wiser than we are. Now, what about the problem of the Messiah and Christ? How can you have Christ, Christos, and the Messiah, the same word, dying? Well, I think we need to go back to the Old Testament. We need to go back to passages like Psalm 22. You need to go back to passages like Isaiah 53. You need to go back to passages like Psalm 69. Because when you go back to those passages, they refer to the Messiah, and they refer to the coming not just once, but 2 different times. The first time coming as a suffering servant, and the second time coming as a triumphant king. And this is what you find in the Old Testament, Shabiat. So therefore, there was an expectation that the first coming of the Messiah would be as a suffering servant. And if you can't get it more clear than Isaiah 53, the first verses that you find there in Isaiah 53, where he would come and with his stripes we would be healed. This is the expectations that the Jews had of the Messiah. Unfortunately, they didn't read their own scriptures. There are still many Jews today that are still looking for a triumphant entrance of their Messiah. If you look back at the Old Testament, there is no problem whatsoever with understanding that that Messiah would come as a suffering servant. And only then the second time would he come as a triumphant king. Okay, do you see? There's not a contradiction there. The proof of the resurrection, we've talked quickly about them. The empty tomb, you say there was no empty tomb. If there was no empty tomb, why was no body ever found? To this day, no one has been able to come up with a body. Neither the Jews, neither the Romans. To this day, the tomb is still empty. If that's not proof of the resurrection, I don't know what is. But you need to go back to the witnesses. You say that they had a difficult time understanding who Jesus was or recognizing him. I don't see that when I read the scriptures. I don't see where you're going with that. There are many different instances in 1 Corinthians 15 that talk not only about those disciples that saw him, but over 500 who saw him at one time. They knew who their Christ was. They'd been with him for 3 years. Of course they recognized who he was. This was not a problem. It's not a problem for them. It's not a problem for me. And of course, then you need to ask, why is it that they then changed their lives because of that resurrection? Because see, every one of the disciples, many of them were just men like you and me. Some of them were not learned. Some of them were just fishermen. They had no reason to give up everything that they believed and to follow a man, who had not only died, and so supposedly had broken up everything that they had believed in, but then who rose again triumphantly and brought back basically everything that they then based their whole lives on. Because what we know about the disciples is that every one of them died for this except for one. They all died for this belief. Would they have died? Would they have given themselves their lives because they didn't believe Christ had risen again? Certainly not. Let me just finish and just say, as a Christian, I need to go back and I need to see 1 Corinthians 15. I need to go back and I need to see those who have gone before me. And I need to go back and I need to look at their testimony and their witness. Here were these disciples. They were following a man. They believed they knew what this man was doing, and yet this man suddenly is crucified in front of them, comes back and appears to them, walks right through the wall, appears to them and shows them as the resurrected Jesus Christ. The man they saw on the cross now was resurrected. What would it do to you if you were in their presence? I hope it would change your lives like it changed the lives of those disciples. Because it's because of that one act in history that everything has changed. It's because of that one act in history, because of the resurrection, that Christianity is what it is today, and because of that one fact that many of you who are sitting here today know and are sure, just like the disciples back then 2,000 years ago, that Christ did not only die, he rose again. That is an assured fact for them. It is an assured fact for me. I don't see any contradiction in that. I don't know why, but you can't see it as well. Thank you for your time.